It began with a sound no one noticed, a low hum beneath the wind, steady, patient, alive. Somewhere in the fog of a midnight rail yard, a red signal blinked once, and the ground answered. Steel groaned. Pistons hissed. Engines that had slept for years came awake together, as if America itself had taken a breath. There were no speeches, no headlines, just movement. While Europe burned and the Pacific roared, another front was forming in silence, not on battlefields, but on rails. Men with oil-stained hands tightened bolts and waited for a whistle that would never stop. You could smell the oil in the air, mixed with coal smoke and frost. The night carried it like a warning, something vast, invisible and awake. Every few minutes, a light would flash through the fog, one more locomotive easing forward, carrying pieces of a war no one could yet see. Each sound echoed between warehouses, a clang, a hiss, a distant call, until the whole city seemed to breathe in rhythm with the rails. They said the war moved by ship and by sky, but that night, it began to move by earth, by rails buried under snow and smoke. When the first convoy vanished into the dark, no one cheered, no one spoke. Only the ground trembled, as if the continent itself had decided to fight. In Berlin, the numbers made sense. Every analyst agreed. America could not move that much steel. Ports had limits, ships had schedules and rail lines. They were built for passengers, not for armies. On paper, it was impossible. You could calculate the distance from Detroit to the Pacific, the tonnage of a Sherman tank, and still, the math would fail. A colonel traced lines across a wall map. "How do they feed 3 oceans at once?" he asked. Another officer smirked. "They don't, they can't." Reports flowed in like smoke, U-boats sinking convoys, factories hitting output ceilings. Logic said the American system should have cracked under its own weight. But something didn't fit. Convoys kept leaving. Fronts never slowed. Each week the flow grew faster, steadier, as if the country had found a hidden heartbeat under its soil. They called it the anomaly. In the dim light of war rooms, German officers circled the same map again and again, searching for ports that didn't exist, for supply lines that ran in silence. They didn't know the answer yet, but the ground did, because beneath their equations, America's rails were already awake, and the math was about to break. Across the continent, they began to appear, not on maps or headlines, but behind factories and in the shadows of cornfields. Long slabs of steel and timber, angled toward the horizon, ramps built in silence, welded by hands that smelled of grease and cold iron. Sparks burst against their gloves. The metal felt alive, warm even in winter air. No names, no signs, just one purpose: to connect America's heartbeat to its war. In Kansas, they built them beside wheat fields. In Ohio, under the cover of smoke from steel mills. In California, where desert wind carried the sound for miles. By day, they looked like skeletons of bridges. By night, they became gateways. At night, sparks flashed beneath blackout covers. Teams of welders, carpenters, and soldiers turned empty land into arteries of motion. The air hung thick with the smell of coal dust and sweat, the taste of hot steel on every breath. Each ramp could swallow a tank or a plane in minutes. Freight cars locked. Brakes hissed and the train would roll out before dawn, its cargo sealed, its destination classified. From Chicago to Seattle, from Dallas to the coast, thousands of these hidden mouths fed the war. Factories no longer waited for ships. The rails had become the docks. They didn't just move supplies. They moved time itself. Every weld, every bolt, every angle measured in seconds saved. And when the first train pulled away, its wheels echoed like a drumbeat through the night, bridges between invention and victory. By dawn, the rails were alive, engines lined up like soldiers, steam rising from their steel lungs. Every 15 minutes, a whistle cut through the fog. Every 15 minutes, another train left. Flat cars with tanks, boxcars with ammunition and rations, a moving anatomy of war. From the Midwest to the ports, the ground pulsed like a living map. Signal lamps blinked red, green, red, a heartbeat in metal. In Chicago, the night sky glowed orange from furnaces. In Los Angeles, sparks danced over the ocean wind. No parades, no speeches, just motion. Factories fed directly into the rails, steel to wheel, hammer to heartbeat, a nation moving faster than thought. Telegraph lines crackled beside the tracks, carrying coded orders that turned steel into strategy. If you stood beside the rails, you felt it before you heard it. The air trembled first, then came the sound. 1,000 tons of iron surging forward, the sound of a country shifting its weight toward victory. And in that endless procession of smoke and sparks, you could almost believe the rails themselves were alive, iron veins pumping the lifeblood of a world at war. Far across the Atlantic, German intelligence tried to explain the impossible. Recon flights brought back photographs and trains stretching from horizon to horizon. At first they thought the images were faked, but the pictures kept coming night after night. The glow of furnaces, rows of freight cars like marching light. Someone whispered, "They're not fighting a war, they're building one." In a cold Berlin office, an engineer studied the photos, his pencil trembling over the paper. He had built bridges his whole life, measured strength in tons and rivets, but this was something else. He leaned closer and whispered, "They turned their land into a weapon. If those trains were real, every calculation was wrong. America wasn't supplying a front, it was feeding an entire world." A long pause settled over the room, the kind that feels heavier than silence itself. German engineer finally said, "We prepared for their ships, their planes, their soldiers. We never prepared for their trains." Silence followed, because in that moment they understood. The war wasn't decided by the front lines, but by the quiet machinery behind them. They hadn't just moved supplies, they had moved a continent. The war ended, engines went quiet. Stations that once shook the ground stood still. Grass crawled between the rails. The ramps rusted, under rain that no one waited out anymore. Somewhere, a whistle blew, not for departure but for memory. Men who built those lines came home with stories they never told, of nights that smelled of iron, and mornings where the earth itself seemed to breathe. Years passed. The world forgot, but the earth remembers. In certain valleys, when the wind cuts just right, you can still hear it. The faint metallic hum, the ghost beat of engines that never stopped completely. Rust spreads like memory across the old steel. Wooden beams crack under frost, but still hold their shape, like bones that refuse to lie down. They say America won the war with factories and courage. Maybe so, but victory moved on. Rails. The silence feels like memory itself. And though the trains have long since stopped, the tracks still breathe softly, steadily, as if the land itself remembers show a nation once loaded its war. One train at a time.